DMC Devil May Cry is a game I've been wanting to review since I started this channel. It's a game that I can never truly understand why so many people didn't like it upon release, but I also didn't feel as though I could properly articulate how I felt about the game without truly diving into it. So currently, I now have 6 playthroughs of the game and a platinum trophy under my belt, so I think I'll be able to break down the good, the bad, and everything in between to finally define the quality of this game through my own eyes. Is this game truly as treacherous as some would make it out to seem? Or is it a solid reboot to the franchise? Ladies and gentlemen, let's find out together in my review of DMC Devil May Cry. Personally, I think I have a fairly unique perspective of the Devil May Cry series of games. Up until this game's release, I was completely unfamiliar with the franchise and stumbled upon it by complete accident. Back in 2013, I remember being at my cousin's house browsing through the Xbox game store just to see if I could find anything new to play, and I eventually came across a game titled DMC Devil May Cry. While I thought the name was weird, I gave the game a try anyway, and I fell in love with the fast-paced combat presented in the game. There was nothing else I wanted to play as badly as this. But unfortunately, I was only 11 years old at the time and I couldn't go out and just buy the game myself, so I spent the next few months playing the ever-living shit out of the demo. But that was 9 years ago. Since then, I've played through DMC multiple times in every other game in the franchise. So how does it hold up? Well, to start things off, I think the story has a very wonderful concept going for it. The game is about a society that is run by a corrupt government. A government that is run by demons, essentially using propaganda and poison to control mankind. And no one is aware of this because the demons disguise themselves as human beings to blend in with everyday life. Our protagonist Dante, however, can see the world for how shitty it truly is, but doesn't really care until he's approached by a terrorist organization called the Order. Their goal is essentially to expose the demons to society and end their rule over mankind. This group is led by Dante's long-lost twin brother Virgil, who reveals the truth about Dante's tragic backstory, convincing Dante to join the Order, and as a team they go on a journey to merge the human world with the demon realm and finally put it into the demon's control. I genuinely like the idea that Ninja Theory was going for with this game. It's vastly different than how the main franchise handles the series lore, which isn't a bad thing for a reboot. However, the idea is only truly as great as its presentation, and I think that's where the story falls short, specifically with the dialogue. I think this game has some of the most awkward dialogue I've ever seen in a video game. The characters speak and react to situations unlike any human being ever would, creating a large disconnect between the audience and the characters. Like, here's an example.
Poor mother. I don't know my mother, but if you're calling me a son of a bitch, you wouldn't be the first.
Like, why did he say that? Why would anyone say that? None of the characters feel real in the story. Adding to that is the lack of character development that we get from each character. This is something that I noticed after multiple playthroughs of the game, but we don't really get to know our main characters like at all. And the little we do get to know from them isn't enough to make up for some of their very unlikable moments. Like when Virgil is willing to abandon Kat after she's been kidnapped by the demons, or when he unreasonably kills the main villain's fiance and child fairly unprovoked. It was very unnecessary to watch. And don't even get me started on Dante. It's a shame to say that the main character is also the most unlikable person in the game, which is such a large contrast from how we all view the original Dante. The original Dante was always cool because of how level-headed he was. No matter the circumstances, he always seemed to be in full control over whatever situation he's in. If not, he's never worried as for whatever challenge lies ahead, he can face with ease. He's confident, if you will. This reboot Dante comes off more as arrogant and pretentious. While he may be just as skilled in combat as the original Dante, he's much more careless getting himself into situations and having to get himself out. And it's more annoying to have to watch him because these situations are Dante's fault, like how he gets himself dragged into limbo in the 4th stage for being an asshole, and he does a bunch of careless shit like that throughout the first half of the game. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't charming and enjoyable moments throughout the game. I'd be lying if I said I didn't at the very least giggle at some of the dialogue and circumstances shown in the game. But I think my favorite part of the story is without a doubt the world that it takes place in. In the game, the world is divided between the human world and Limbo, where the demons reside in their true form. And Dante enters and leaves the realm of Limbo multiple times throughout the game, and the scenery surrounding it is phenomenal. Whether he enters by accident or it's intentional, watching the transition from the human world to Limbo is always fascinating to me. As well as Limbo tends to reconstruct itself to combat Dante, and it's really cool to watch. So overall, I'm not the biggest fan of how the characters are in the story, but I am a fan of the direction that the story and the world takes place. But real shit, that's not the reason why I, or anyone for that matter, is primarily playing Devil May Cry. We're playing it for the gameplay. So, how is it? The game is a hack and slash, so there's one style of gameplay with 2 elements to it. The first element, of course, is the combat. To be honest, I think that DMC has some of the best combat that I've ever seen in a character action game. It does a phenomenal job of combining the fast-paced, frantic, stylish combat from the original games with its own twist to create its own unique experience. For starters, the combat is super simple. There are 2 attack buttons, a primary attack that you'll be using a lot for starting combos and juggling enemies, and the launch combo that you'll, use to launch enemies. There are also ranged attacks that can be used in between attacks to further extend combos and boost your stylish meter. The name of the game is to essentially defeat enemies in the most stylish way possible, and that's done by creating insane combos by combining a variety of different moves together to finish off your opponent. So your goal in every combat situation is to be as creative as possible. Now, I noticed after playing through all of the other Devil May Cry games that DMC has a large focus on aerial combos and juggling. A large portion of the combat is held in the air, with Dante juggling multiple enemies in the air, and for this reason, I find the combat to be the easiest in the franchise. This is because most of the enemies can really only attack you on the ground, so if you're spending a great deal of time in the air, then they can't hurt you. Now, that's not always the case, but I found a lot of situations where I am completely annihilating the enemy, even on some of the insane challenge difficulties that you can unlock. Not to mention that stringing combos together are the easiest that they have ever been in a franchise. Every weapon has 2 different combos that can be alternated between by pausing before the last strike of the attack, and you have the option to switch weapons and perform that weapon's alternate attack to endlessly string along enemies. Speaking of weapons, throughout the game, Dante will unlock a variety of different artillery throughout the game to continue spicing up the combat. These will range from additional angelic weapons to demonic weapons and even firearms. Including guns, there are a total of 8 weapons that you'll eventually have access to simultaneously. Personally, I really like how every weapon is unique and brings something new to the table, allowing for a ton of experimentation depending on your playstyle. My playstyle allowed me to strategize around different combat scenarios depending on what kind of enemy is thrown at me, as well as how many of them there are. For example, I found that the angelic weapons use light attacks that cover a lot of area, so for me they become very useful with crowd control. I tend to use them in situations where I'm either surrounded by a large number of weak enemies or I'm getting closed in on by an enemy I didn't see. On the flip side, however, the demonic weapons are useful in completely different scenarios. I found that the demonic weapons create very high damaging attacks but have a slower startup, leaving you vulnerable to attack by enemies, so I found them the most useful in counterattack situations against juggernaut enemies. Now, every combat situation is different and will truly test your skill and understanding of the game's mechanics. Every fight you encounter will typically either bring a challenge in enemy variety or environmental hazards, or even a combination of both. Towards the end game, you'll be forced to fight enemies that can only take damage from angelic weapons, mixed with enemies that can only take damage from demonic weapons, forcing you to really be on your A game during combat. I would like to mention that I am a fan of the enemy variety. Going through the game, you are consistently introduced to new enemies that require their own way of being beaten, whether that's breaking their shield, abusing their weak spots, or even countering their attacks. Depending on how well you defeat your enemies will depict your stylish ranking, which is a large part of what makes the Devil May Cry series of games. Since the idea of the game is to defeat your enemies as stylish as possible, you're ranked on how well you do just that. The rankings range from a D rank all the way to a triple S rank, and in order to get the highest rank in each battle, you have to consistently perform a variety of different attacks that'll boost the gauge exponentially and avoid getting hit at all costs. Genuinely speaking, that should realistically be your only concern in regards to dropping set rank. In the other Devil May Cry games, the stylish gauge will increase quickly but also decrease quickly. But in DMC, the gauge doesn't really decrease unless you get hit, making it ridiculously easy to get triple S ranks. If you genuinely wanted to, you could get a ton of triple S ranks just by spamming Arbiter. Now, there is one more aspect to the gameplay, and that is the platforming. While you aren't fighting, you're doing basic platforming, and believe it or not, there's actually a lot of platforming in this game. Luckily, it's handled very well because most of the platforming situations require you to use some of Dante's abilities. The game forces you to alternate between the angelic lift and the demonic pull to cross bottomless pits, as well as the angel boost to cross gaps you wouldn't be able to normally. Combining those moves together in sequence is pretty cool, and I can get down with that. However, I can't get down with Dante's very fucking awkward double jump. I feel as though the double jump takes away too much of his forward momentum, making certain platforming situations more annoying and having to save myself with the angel boost. It's a minor inconvenience, but I just felt the need to mention it. So the game is split into 20 different missions. Each one essentially has the same task. That task is to reach the end of the stage, and that's done by platforming through the level and defeating every demon that stands in your way. All the levels are linear with a bit of exploration so you can find extra collectibles, but for the most part, you'll be trapped in a closed off area where you need to kill every enemy in order to proceed. On paper, this sounds like it would get super repetitive, but each level brings something new to the table to make sure that each combat situation feels unique. Like in the 5th mission where you have to avoid poison pouring onto the ground while fighting enemies, or in mission 13 where you have to change between demonic and angelic weapons to avoid damage damage from the changing tiles on the floor. Subtle aspects like that in the level design are what really make the experience in Devil May Cry for me. And I could say the same about the game's boss fights. Truthfully, I think the game has some winners when it comes to boss fights. While I don't think all of them are great, I genuinely love the concept behind a few of the bosses, specifically the third boss. I love how the fight transitions from defensively dodging Bob's attacks to being transported to relentlessly fighting while being put on the news. Aside from the spectacle of each boss fight, I think they're pretty mid for the most part. The reason being is that there's no challenge whatsoever, and each boss takes the slightest amount of effort to conquer. Just spam your demonic weapons and watch the boss's health literally disintegrate. I will say that I'm not a fan of how easy these bosses are compared to the other Devil May Cry games. So overall, what is my final opinion of the game? Well, I genuinely feel as though the game was misunderstood. I think people had a difficult time accepting this game for what it is, and instead they hated it for what it's not. I really am not a fan of too many aspects of the game, but what I do like is the seamlessly smooth combat that keeps me coming back over and over again, to the point where I think this game is worth a try solely based on the combat. The combat is the reason why I turn the game on, and it's the reason why I continue to play. If you ever get the chance and you see DMC on sale, I would definitely recommend giving it a try with an open mind. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, remember to hit the like button and subscribe if you're new. And as always, stay tuned for the next video.